Hello, everyone. This is Haley Hansen. I'm the leader of Husch Blackwell's Higher Education Group. We are excited to welcome you today to our webinar on the new U.S. Department of Education's regulations regarding reshaping accreditation and state authorization. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. I'd like to take a minute and highlight just a few of them for you. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them via the question box. We are planning on having some time at the end of the webinar to answer questions. However, if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, then we will follow up via email after the webinar. We do truly appreciate audience participation and encourage you to submit questions as we are moving through the webinar today. There's also an icon to assist you with your viewing preferences. Please note that you can expand your slide area by clicking on the maximize icon on the top right of your slide or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide. If you have any technical difficulties, you can click on the help icon. It is marked with a question mark and provides the most common technical issues during webinars. Also, a copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource list that looks like a folder on the bottom of your screen. So you're welcome to print the slides as well. This program has been approved for continuing legal education credit in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee. We have applications in, but we are pending to get approval in Wisconsin and Texas. And as soon as we have that, we will make sure anyone in those states is notified as well. To report your hours in Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, Tennessee, or Texas, please click on the CLE icon at the bottom of your screen and complete the questions. Also, you'll receive a recording of this webinar that's available for watching and sharing at your institution. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance. Joining me today is my partner, Lisa Parker. Lisa represents a full range of higher education institutions, including private, not-for-profit, public, and healthcare affiliated institutions. She formerly has served as an administrator at a small private college, and Lisa's background really focuses on, and her passion is on, accreditation and accreditation-related issues. So we're so happy to have Lisa join us today. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and talk about our topics that we're going to cover today. Our agenda is really focused on the change in geography of accreditation and the impact on our regional accreditors. We're also going to talk about streamlined approaches for institutional changes, the new rules as it relates to teach-out programs, and then we're also going to spend some time on state authorization for distance education programs. So what we're going to do today is just talk a little bit about these new regulations, and we thought it would be interesting to start with the first poll question. How long have these now final regulations been in the negotiated rulemaking process? So is your guess 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, or 10 years? So if you go ahead and fill out that question, we will provide you the answer. So far we have one, and they've answered it correctly, so we'll see how many more. All right, with just over about 50% reporting, we'll show you the answer to this. And it looks like it was kind of across the range. Honestly, these rules have been in negotiation over a period of 10 years. And so with that, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk us through how did we get here.
Great. Thank you, Haley. So back about in January of 2019, about a year ago, the Department of Education, as part of Secretary DeVos's Rethink Higher Ed agenda, began various negotiated rulemaking sessions to really cover a wide range of topics. And when it first came out that they were going to cover so many topics, there was a lot of concern that it was going to be chaotic just because there was going to be so much to be discussed. And so ultimately, the topics were grouped into 3 buckets: accreditation and state authorization, distance learning and educational innovation, and teach grants and faith-based entities. And today we're just going to focus on the first bucket, which was accreditation and state authorization. So for this process, they used the negotiated rulemaking process, which is notorious for oftentimes not being very constructive. But for this, they used 16 negotiators. And they came from a variety of backgrounds, including from folks from financial aid administrators, faith-based institutions, public and private colleges and universities, as well as for-profit institutions. And in particular, there was a representative from an institution that has mostly online programs, since we're talking about state authorization, which tends to focus on distance ed. And there was also representation from the accreditors, both a regional accreditor, a national accreditor, as well as a programmatic accrediting agency were all represented. And one of the things that was really interesting about this is that one of the complaints has been that while it seemed like there was a well-rounded group, there have been complaints that there wasn't enough a representative for student advocacy or a representative from state attorney general's offices. But despite all of that, consensus was reached with respect to these rules, which hasn't happened for nearly a decade. And so the U.S. Department of Education was very excited about that and sort of touted that. The proposed rule then issued on June 12th of 2019. There was a public comment period, and then on October 31st, on Halloween, the department announced that they would be publishing the new rule on November 1st, which they then did publish, and then the effective date of the new rule is July 1 of 2020. So we're going to talk about these different regulations and how they impact accreditation, but it's important to recognize that to the extent we're talking about things that are going to impact accreditation rules, the accreditors have until July 1st to change their rules before they go into effect. So the purpose of the new regulations, per the department, was really to enable accrediting agencies to update their standards. There has been a big focus on innovation, and this is just not from having a Republican administration. This was also under the Obama administration. An idea that accreditation was just operating too slow, thinking that perhaps there was a way to streamline the process, speed it up, and find ways just to really encourage and support innovation. And again, this is part of Secretary DeVos's Rethink Higher Education agenda. And one of the things that they're really focused on, and you'll see it when we talk about the regs, is to find ways to give accreditors more flexibility. And also the idea is that if the accreditors have more flexibility, and also if maybe there are more accrediting agencies, there might be better opportunities to help implement programs that will better help workforce needs, and we'd be able to see speedier program approvals. Many institutions struggle with just trying to get new programs approved, and there's a great amount of delay. And the idea was that this was something that could help speed things up. Now, on the other hand, sort of the left-leaning groups who are opposed to the new regulations have said that they find the new regulations will be too easy on accrediting agencies. And one particular group said they thought that this would just make sure that accreditation would be a race to the bottom. There is fear by some that these new rules are too relaxed, and because it was announced that the new rules were going to be published on Halloween, there was one group said that they thought it was a horror show and that this would ultimately be a nightmare for students because it would just be too relaxed. Student advocacy groups hadn't been part of the negotiated rulemaking, and that it could potentially let institutions that perhaps shouldn't be qualified, it might allow them to implement programs quickly that perhaps didn't deserve those qualifications. So while we're going to talk about these new rules and go through the new rules, it's important to understand that even though we have a new regulations that are going to go into effect July 1 of 2020, there's a potential chance that all of this could be for nothing because we are still continuing to wait for reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And if that happens, that could potentially rewrite all of the rules. And, folks in Congress have said that they would prefer to rewrite the law versus having the department rewrite regulations. Additionally, we've got lawmakers on the Democratic side that are still publishing bills in an effort to change accreditation. So earlier this month, on February 7th, there was a new bill announced, the Accreditation Reform Act, which potentially seeks to amend the Higher Education Act to, again, increase accountability and oversight of accreditation process, which in some ways seems to be different, very different from what these rules do. That new bill would seek to, tighten the procedures around accrediting agencies getting recognition and cause accrediting agencies to increase their oversight. Whereas in some ways, while the department says that their new rule isn't going to take away from quality, as you'll see, the new rule definitely makes an effort to expedite and to streamline the accreditation process. But we'll see what happens if this new rule will be able to go into practice or if it'll be circumvented by potentially the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act or other laws. I'm now going to turn it back to Haley.
And if it does, Lisa, I think we'll have another webinar on that then too. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about Accreditation 101 and where we've been. So accreditation was the concept of accreditation came about in the 1890s as a way to distinguish between secondary and post-secondary education. It wasn't until the 1950s that there was this partnership with the government in which it would be the reliable authority with regard to quality and quality education, and there was this tie that to be able to get federal financial aid, you must be accredited in order for the department to give you that aid. And so it has always been voluntary since the 1890s. It's been a voluntary process. I think some institutions feel like that it was kind of voluntold after the tie with the Title IV funding. And so that's where we've been. We've had traditionally 6 regional accrediting agencies. This map shows you where those regionally accredited agencies are located and that they could not go outside of their region, that this was part of the requirements of this distinction as regional accreditation. So that's where we've been. Now let's move on to where we are. The impact of these new regs on specific geographic limitations is in the preamble, the regs actually specifically state that there is an artificial distinction between regional and national accreditation, and it has been removed. So there is no distinction now from the Department of Education between regional and national accreditation. And moreover, has said that regional accreditors may decide to accredit outside of their region. So no longer requiring the regional accreditors to just go back in that former slide and only accredit institutions within their region. But it is going to be up to the regional accreditors to decide what states they're going to accredit within. And there's at least been some talk or rumors amongst the regional accreditors that they're going to agree to stay within those 6 regions. Again, there's no distinction now between, as of when these regulations go into effect as of July 1st, between regional and national accreditation. So it really will be up to those accreditors to decide where they're going to accept applications for accreditation. The new regs also say that the accrediting agencies will not be required to accept applications for accreditation from institutions in states where they only accredit additional locations or branch campuses, because sometimes we've seen that as well as institutions have multiple campus locations across the country. So it's going to be up to the accrediting agencies to decide where they're going to accredit from. And I think that will be important to see how that all plays out as we move closer to July 1st. So a lot of people are asking then, well, then wouldn't people that are unhappy with their current accreditation jump ship and move to another accreditor. And the regulations talk about this and say that if you decide you do want to move to a new accreditor, that you'd have to provide reasonable cause to the new accreditor for that change, and also the Secretary of the Department would need to approve in order to make that move to a new accreditor. So things that we've heard consistently are, let's say you're a institution that is currently part of an overall hospital system and not separately incorporated, and you believe that the accreditation requirements will cause you to lose your Medicare pass-through funding. That would be a reasonable cause to move to a new accreditor, and you could request through that two-step process to, again, a new accreditor would have to take you as well, but you could move to a different accreditor. So multiple institutional accreditation, so if you have multiple accreditation within your institution itself, not programmatic accreditation, but multiple institutional accreditation, you must also provide that reasoning, so the reasonable cause, to all of the accreditors and receive the Secretary's approval if you want to add another institutional accreditor. It doesn't apply to programmatic accreditors. So it won't be quite as easy for institutions to just change accreditors. The regulations also provide what reasonable cause means, and as you can imagine, it can mean a variety of different things, but essentially that there is some reason in which your institution no longer fits within this model, doesn't make sense for your institution, and it really needs to go to another accreditor in order to really be able to carry out its mission, vision, values, other parts of the institution. All right. So as Lisa said, there has been a lot of, I'd say, scrutiny on these regulations, saying that they really are going to open the floodgates of who can be possibly accrediting agencies, and the fact that there won't be as much oversight of the accrediting agencies. And so there's this new concept that's now been added for when the accrediting agencies need to be reaffirmed as an accreditor, and that concept is substantial compliance. That those the agencies may be in substantial compliance in order to continue to be an accrediting agency, and that you may submit monitoring reports, and that these monitoring reports, again with substantial compliance, have a new definition in terms of how the oversight will actually work, but address really minor issues that are being reviewed when the accrediting agencies are reviewed versus some greater sanction that the accrediting agency could be subjected to. And so a lot of people that are not as happy with these regulations really think that this is lessening the oversight on our accrediting agencies and allowing more agencies to either have issues in which they're in substantial compliance but not full compliance, or have potentially more accreditors or more options, which I think, as Lisa was talking about, there was a sense that there should be more options when it comes to where an institution can be accredited. So let's talk about the kind of segues right into more options for accreditors of what does this really mean at your institution. And we've kind of broken it down into 4 buckets. Really, the end goals are flexibility and expediency, as Lisa said. That's what these things are trying to get at the core, at the root of, trying to make the process more flexible and faster so that institutions can do what they need to do in order to continue growth or to move in the direction that the institution needs to move into. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth of some of these, but I do want to focus on the good cause and circumstances beyond an institution's control. So the rule actually establishes that an institution may remain out of compliance with an accrediting agency's standards for a period of up to 3 years and longer for good cause shown, where circumstances are beyond the institution's control. So this specifically was to kind of talk about, and they've pointed it out in the regulations, natural disasters that would happen at a particular institution or things that are beyond their control, to provide more flexibility to allow institutions to remain accredited. Also, the timeline for compliance have changed as well. So let's talk about these. So essentially, these timelines that had been described by institutions as really overly prescriptive by the department. These timelines that accrediting agencies must take adverse action against an institution or program that's not in compliance with the standards have been removed. And in its place, the accrediting agency, will be able to provide a written timeline for coming into compliance that's reasonable based on the specific issues that's going on at the institution and that aligns with the mission and educational objectives of that institution or potentially that program. And so, again, increasing the flexibility of the accreditation agency to be able to work with institutions and to determine what is reasonable and what is a reasonable timeline. The timelines may have intermediate compliance checkpoints, but they cannot exceed the lesser of either 4 years or 150% of the length of the longest program. And so, but if it's a programmatic accreditor, it'd be the length of the program, or if it's an institution, if it's an issue with the institutional accreditation, 150% of the length of its longest program. So that really changes things in terms of adverse actions that can be taken against institutions. And so essentially they're eliminating this cookie-cutter approach that was really prescribed by the department. I think that's a very important change. The next change is that under this rule, the department is going to require an accrediting agency to have a policy to take immediate adverse action and to identify in the policy when that action is warranted. And so you're going to now not have a waiting period by the accrediting agency to either put you on notice or take up some other steps. You can now, the accrediting agency must adopt a policy that can put an institution on immediate adverse action. And under that immediate adverse action allows the institution to remain out of compliance for that 3 years or longer with good cause, which we talked about earlier. And then finally gave some more clarity with regard to adverse actions. Number one, they must be provided in writing, and it's when a final action has been taken with regard to the institution. And more importantly, institutions must disclose any adverse actions within 7 business days to all students and prospective students. So that's going to be really important as well, that those adverse actions must be disclosed within that 7 business day time period. So another key and important change for institutions. A little bit more on adverse actions. Let's talk about programmatic sanctions. So the new regulations allow accrediting agencies the ability to impose programmatic level sanctions on an institution's noncompliance with that accrediting agency's standards. So at a program level, they can now impose sanctions. They obviously must notify if they have a programmatic accreditor of those as well. And again, they may be limited to the program. And that's a very important change, especially if they believe that a program, that there's noncompliance for a program, that you can effectively address the source of noncompliance without having to include the entire institution when it's really just that program. So that's an important change as well. And then finally, I just want to point out something that was in the regulations that I thought it was important, is that personally identifiable information, that the regulations say that accrediting bodies must redact all PII from their submissions to the department, so that there is no request, FOIA request that would include personally identifiable information that the department would have to give out. And so when you're looking at these adverse actions and sanctions, at times there's lots of media that goes around these sanctions as well, and they will ask the department for information that they receive from their accrediting bodies regarding some of these sanctions. And this is a new requirement for the accrediting body before they provide that information to the department. Another big and important change is appeals and the appeal panel. So it requires the appeal panel to actually explain the decision. So you must have some written explanation if your accrediting agency has an appeals process in which that appeal will be explained in writing to the institution. It also, for the first time, limits the power of the panel. So no longer can a decision be reversed by the appeal panel. They must remand to the original decision maker. And so in lots of cases, that's the team of peer reviewers. They must now remand it. They may not reverse decisions. They can only affirm, amend, or remand. And so that is going to be a big change as we look at our accrediting bodies, that they are going to have to change their policy regarding appeals, and their some call it the Institutional Action Committee, but other types of committees that look at the appeal process. And the department was really clear that when it looks at appeal panels, it does not think appeal panels should be making a final decision, that they should not serve as the final decision maker. So that is going to be really important as you look at this appeals process with adverse actions that are taken against colleges and universities. So Lisa, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about our next topic, which is religious mission.
Okay, thank you. Great. So for religious mission, we're sort of switching gears here, but one of the concerns that the department responded to in these regulations is the concerns raised by faith-based institutions that certain accrediting agencies might be biased when it comes to faith-based schools. And in particular, there was one regional accrediting agency that was considering changing one of its standards to require that institutions adopt processes to ensure inclusive and equitable treatment of diverse populations. And some of the religious institutions became concerned about this because they thought that that might require them to engage with policies that don't fit their religious beliefs, such as if they only were to recognize marriage between a man and a woman, that maybe based on their accreditor requirements, they would have to recognize a marriage that didn't coincide with their beliefs. And so in response, the department, in coming out with this regulation, put in the regulation a specific definition for a religious mission, and that is here on this slide. And it just goes to show that you have to have your governing board approve an institution's religious mission, and it has to be based on religious beliefs. It is important that this is different than an institution that, let's just say, has a faith-based history. Maybe it was founded as a religious institution but no longer is. This is really just for institutions that include as part of their mission their faith. And so for those, the department specifically included regulations that said that accrediting agencies need to respect the religious mission of institutions, and they cannot take whatever that religious mission is and make that a negative factor when they review institutions. And over the last month, 2 department officials have spoke publicly about this, just saying that this is the department's way of making sure that institutions are able to exercise their religious beliefs. And one of the things that happened that was very interesting was that Diane Howard-Jones, who's the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of the Department of Education, took it a step further and said this discussion about mission is to go even further, and that it is her hope that these regulations will mean that accrediting agencies just don't really focus on what, let's say, a religious school's mission is, but all schools' mission. And so if your school has a mission that says all of our students are going to be critical thinkers, according to Diane Howard-Jones, the accrediting agency should make sure that you are in some way measuring that your students are all becoming critical thinkers. So this idea of really focusing on mission is going to go beyond religious mission. So moving on to talk about one of the other changes in the rules is having to do with substantive changes. We all know that when an institution makes a substantive change under the regulations, they have to get their accrediting agency's prior approval before they make that change. And under these regulations and as part of the negotiated rulemaking, it became clear that those substantive changes going forward are only going to be what the department calls high impact or high risk changes. And these are the changes that fall into that category. So if your accrediting agency right now is requiring approval of something that's not on this list as a substantive change, after July 1st, it may not require prior approval. And so these things are things that you would expect, to be a substantive change, such as a mission change, a change of controller ownership. You drastically change the types of programs if you only offer healthcare and now you're offering something different. You go from only being undergraduate to now offering graduate programs. You change the measurement around how you're measuring time for your students in terms of clock to credit hour. You acquire another institution. You start partnering for a substantial part of your program with a non-Title IV institution, or you start to offer direct assessment. These things are substantive changes. One of the questions that we've been getting a lot are, did these rules change how the department looks at changes of ownership or control? And there were no significant changes with respect to how the department looks at changes of ownership or control. Another substantive change that wasn't on that initial list is just a substantive change for a new location. But here we have a big switch. So now the department's saying under these new regulations, when you are adding a branch campus or an additional location, while that's a substantive change that normally requires prior approval, you do not have to get prior approval for a branch campus or a substantive change if you meet the criteria that's listed on this slide. So if your institution has successfully completed at least one cycle of accreditation, you've already had your accreditor approve 2 additional locations in the past, you're not currently on probation or you're not operating under some negative action for at least the last 3 years, and you're not on provisional certification with the department. And if you meet that criteria, you no longer have to get your accreditor's prior approval for a new branch location or an additional location, as long as you notify your accreditor within 30 days that you added the location, and you also provide evidence that that new location meets accreditation standards. So that is a really big switch and probably beneficial to larger institutions that may have already had several other additional locations previously approved. So with respect to substantive change, while in some ways the substantive change process is going to be less strenuous, if you are what is considered a high-risk institution, you still may have to go through a variety of substantive change approvals. And so that means if your institution is on probation, or you recently had a negative action, or you're right now under provisional certification with the Department of Ed, then some of the ease of going through the substantive change process may not apply to you. But for other institutions, again, in an effort by the department and the accreditors and those that participate in the negotiated rulemaking, in an effort to really speed things up, they're now saying that for some substantive changes, a senior staffer at an accrediting agency can conduct the review. A senior staff person can, within 90 days of you submitting the application, the senior staff person could review it. That alone may be sufficient. Or if the agency says they want that senior staff member's opinion to be reviewed by someone else within the accrediting agency or by the agency itself, that could occur within 180 days. So that could mean that, substantive changes could potentially move substantially quicker than they currently do, which is good news for institutions that are trying to push out new programs and quickly make big changes. Another really substantial change that happens in the new regulations relates to teach-out plans. teach-out plans are going to be required more often than they currently are. And this is a part of a theme throughout this regulation which really focuses on students and making sure that students are protected, especially if an institution could potentially close. So now, under the new regs, a teach-out plan is going to be required if your institution has an audit and it shows that you are a going concern or you get a materially adverse audit opinion. You also are going to have to do a teach-out plan if your institution is placed on reimbursement or heightened cash monitoring by the department. If your accreditor puts your institution on probation, then you're going to have to do a teach-out plan. This is also applicable to schools that have programmatic accreditation. If you're programmatically accredited and you're put on probation, that could also require a teach-out plan. And again, this is a big change because many times an institution may go on probation and you don't normally think, oh my gosh, we have to do a teach-out plan and notify our students of the teach-out plan, but now you will under the new regulations. And of course, if you think that you're going to cease operations of your program or an institution, then of course that will require a teach-out plan. But these new regs really expand the circumstances under which a teach-out plan is required. They also require new elements for a teach-out plan. Many of these elements were already included in accreditor regulations, but things such as listing out all the students impacted, stating how refunds are going to be handled, how records are going to be handled for the students, and things of that nature. Again, this is really a focus on making sure that students aren't harmed if a program or an institution closes. The last thing about teach-out plans, and this is a change, is that now your accrediting agencies are going to have to review all communications with students related to the teach-out plan. So if, for instance, you are on probation and you've got to now do a teach-out plan, your accreditor would need to see what communications you're going to issue to students telling them about the probation and then also about the teach-out plan. So that's a significant switch. Another topic that is covered by the new regs is pre-accreditation. And of course, pre-accreditation is the step prior to either a program or an institution becoming fully accredited by an accrediting agency. And under the new regs, the department has made clear to say that pre-accreditation really should be an instance where those students that participate in a program or an institution that has pre-accreditation receive the same benefits as students who complete an accredited program. And again, this is related to the idea of something going wrong in a program. We've all seen situations, or we're aware of situations, and there's one in the news recently where a nursing college in South Dakota had pre-accreditation for a nursing program. They didn't ultimately get the full accreditation, and then their students weren't able to get licensed. And so with that in mind, this new regulation says to the accrediting agencies, you can only pre-accredit a program or an institution if you are really pretty sure that it's likely going to receive full accreditation. And also, if a program is in or an institution has pre-accreditation, they have to now maintain a teach-out plan that is going to allow their students, especially if those students are going to be able to get licenses, how they'll be able to complete somewhere else to get that license if for some reason the accreditation does not go forward. And then the last piece really on these accreditation regulations is the fact that these regulations now allow for some true flexibility for accreditors. This includes retroactive approvals and the ability of accreditors to be flexible in special circumstances. And so, for example, we're not quite sure how this will play out because it doesn't say a lot in the regs about this, but accreditors are required to have rules around retroactive approvals. So, for example, let's say you forget or you for some reason did not get a new program approved that you were supposed to. There now potentially could be the option of you getting a retroactive approval. Also, they're giving accreditors the ability to have some flexibility if they need to change or alter a decision because they need to somehow relieve an undue hardship on students. And so here again, we're seeing the accreditation regulations allow for some flexibility. And so with that, I think we're about ready to start talking about state authorizations, and I'll hand it back over to Haley.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, so I'm starting with another poll question again. So this is true or false. Under the new regulations, states will have less oversight over distance education programs being taken by students in their state. Is that true, false, or I have no idea? That's why I'm listening to this webinar. Hopefully that made a few of you chuckle, just because it's a dry topic that Lisa and I are trying to provide some life, or put some life into. All right, we've got a few of you responding, and some of you did like the I have no idea response, so I really appreciate that. You found the humor. All right, so we're about at 50%, so let's go ahead and show you the responses. So the answer is true, that states will likely, and there's some states, the attorney generals were not involved in this process, and are very frustrated that they were not involved in this process, and believe that they will, as a state, have less oversight over distance education programs being offered to students in their state. So the answer is true. I love that 38% of you are interested in listening to this webinar to find out the answer, so that's good. So let's talk about distance education and state authorization requirements. So these have been talked about since 2010 as well, about what these are going to ultimately look like. And they are very similar to the Obama area regulations, but there's some very important tweaks that we need to walk through and really explain what they look like. First of all, let's just take it directly from the regs. SARA, which, as you all know, is the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement, and so I'm just going to refer to it as SARA from now on. A lot of you are members of SARA. Has now been officially recognized and accepted by the department within the regs. So I think everyone was happy to see that happen, and have SARA be officially recognized as how you can meet your state authorization requirements. But because SARA is officially recognized, there are some limitations, and a few on what states can independently require if you were meeting SARA requirements. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But this is really where the language comes from that authorizes SARA. And I do want to say as well, the department a few weeks ago had a webinar on distance education and talked a lot about SARA as well, and provided a lot of good content that we have kind of tried to synthesize down a little bit in these slides, but want to make sure that these come from what the department is telling us on distance education as well. So the only kind of difference of again, that SARA cannot impose any member state of the agreement from, you cannot prohibit them from enforcing its own general purpose state laws, but it's still considered to be a part of the approved distance education. So you have state authorization when you're recognized by SARA. SARA has officially been recognized. And the state complaint procedure was removed for SARA institutions. So if you are part of SARA, another benefit is that state complaint procedure has been removed. So I think, again, those who have been actively working with SARA and joining SARA, not only their states joining, but also then institutions joining, we're very happy to see this recognition, and that some of the barriers that were still in place are things that didn't totally align. Now it's the government, so not everything totally aligns, but a lot of those have been removed. So that's very good too. State authorization for religious institutions. One of the things that was changed, and actually a common complaint that I had from some of the state boards of higher education, or those that we had talked to, is some states did not recognize in their state religiously affiliated private institutions. And so there was a real question of how they would be recognized by SARA and what that did, because they were not under their umbrella of recognition. And so now the department has clarified that for those states that had that issue, and considers an institution to be legally authorized to operate in a post-secondary education program even if they're exempt from state authorization as a religious institution in that state. And so, again, that was very helpful because a lot of states were wondering what to do because they don't officially recognize some private religiously affiliated institutions. Again, must still have a state complaint process, but those schools that are part of SARA are exempt from that process, as I said in the last slide. And then finally, the biggest change really from the Obama era guidance to now is that there was the physically located, or the change to how you determine whether where a student is located. This new concept of student location was put into effect and essentially requires a determination of the state which the student is located at the time they initially enroll in the education program, and upon formal notice from a student that their student location has changed. What's really important about student location is that it's going to be up to you as institutions to create your own policy for students regarding student location. And your policy needs to identify things like that, again, that they have an obligation then to let you know when the location has changed, to determine what location means under your policy. So if a student is taking a distance education class and goes to help their aunt who's recovering from hip replacement, I'm just making things up now, but is going to Texas, and they are living in Missouri, and they're going to Texas for 3 weeks to help, they're still going to continue on with their education. Does that mean that the student's location has changed? You can define that under your policy, which is very helpful. You can say that does not constitute a change in the student's location. It's only when a student is actually moving to a new state that then we would change the location. And why this is important is because, and Lisa's going to talk about this a little bit more as well, you must notify students within licensure programs in particular states of whether or not your program meets the requirements for licensure. So at least I'll talk much more in depth about that, but that's going to be really important. You also must be able as an institution to provide the department with written documentation of your determination of a student's location and the basis for that determination. So we really see this coming into really practice by the department, although it's not been explicitly said, through program reviews. So this will be, we see the laundry list of information and policies requested in Title IV program reviews as they come into institutions. They're now going to be requesting information on the institution's policy regarding student location and what that means, how you track it, and how do you make sure that you are complying with the regulations regarding student location. So this is something that you want to get a jump on, because sometimes policies, especially new policies, at an institution can take a little while and have several steps to be approved. This needs to be in place by no later than July 1st. You need to make sure that you have a policy in which you can identify the student location. Okay, Lisa, I'll turn it back over to you to talk about disclosures. I kind of jumped the gun on that a little bit, so I'm sorry.
That's quite all right, because there's a lot to say about disclosures, and it's really a very important part of these state authorization changes. So with respect to disclosures, the biggest piece, and Haley hinted to it, is about professional licensure and certification. So under these new regs, one thing to really understand is that disclosures now apply regardless of the mode of delivery. So this applies to both online and on-ground programs as well as hybrid programs. And so for these situations, your institutions are going to really need to closely take a look around professional licensure and certification, because you need to make sure that either you're designed to meet the educational requirements for the specific vocational license or certification that is required for employment and occupation, or that you advertise as meeting such requirements. You need to both inform your prospective and your currently enrolled students as to the three things that we have listed here. So whether a program meets state licensure and certification requirements, if yes, you know that your program does, no, you know your program does not meet the state educational requirements for licensure or certification. Or the third option is that your institution has not made a determination that its curriculum either meets the state educational requirements for licensure or certification. So this requires you to be knowledgeable about all the different states in which your students are located. And this information, these disclosures as to whether or not your program is going to meet state licensure and certification requirements needs to be, and these are the words of the regulation and the department, readily available. And so what that means, it means that you need to make sure that you are publishing this information on your website or in your catalog. And you also need to make sure that these disclosures are available to prospective students and enrolled students either via email or other electronic communication in certain instances. And so we're going to talk about that a little more, but these disclosure requirements are a really big deal and a very big change in terms of what's required. They could be a lot of work because now we're not just talking about online programs, we're also talking about programs that are on ground. And so in these instances, if you have a student or a prospective student that you know are in a program that does not meet the state educational requirements for licensure or certification, you have to make a direct disclosure to those students. And so this means that you need to provide something directly to that student, something in writing, and you need to do it either before the student signs an enrollment agreement, or if you don't have enrollment agreements, before the student makes a financial commitment to the institution. And so this is a really big change, and it's something where institutions really need to be prepared to make sure that they're ready to make those disclosures for professional and licensure programs. Plus, the new regs also have additional disclosures, and they're listed here on this slide. If, as we were talking about before, if you have a teach-out plan that's required by your accrediting agency, then you have to make a disclosure to students about the teach-out plan. Also, if you now are required to have a disclosure related to transfer of credit policy, it's not unusual to have disclosures around transfer of credit. But here, in particular, you need to make sure that your disclosure includes where your institution will not accept transfer credits from. So if there are certain institutions or certain types of institutions for which your institution will not accept credit, you need to make that known in the disclosures. You also are now required to disclose any written criteria that you use to evaluate and award credit for prior learning experience. So if your institution, for example, awards prior learning experience, let's say, for folks that are in the armed forces or based on prior employment or because a student's able to demonstrate a specific competency, then you need to make sure that you disclose what exactly is your criteria for awarding that prior learning credit. If you also have written arrangements or written agreements, it could be a contract, a memorandum of understanding with another institution or another entity or company that provides all or part of a program. So maybe you're working with some sort of online program management company that actually provides all or even a part of a program. It could be any amount or any portion of a program. Then you are now required to disclose that in your description for the program. So that's a change. You always have to disclose that you have these types of agreements, but now you have to make sure that you include it in the actual disclosure about the program. And then the other item is that you now need to also have disclosures around enforcement actions and prosecutions. And these are only actions that are brought by state or federal law enforcement if you think that a final judgment could result in you having an adverse action by your accrediting agency, having your state authorization revoked, or you're losing your Title IV eligibility. So there you need to make the judgment call that if you think that you are in some sort of action against the government, against your institution, and you think it could be adverse, you now need to disclose that as well. So we have all the disclosure requirements that we just discussed, and then we have ongoing disclosure requirements that were already in place. So those are your current disclosure requirements that were already in Section 66.8.43 of this section of the code. And so those are things like refund policies and disclosing who your accrediting agencies and state regulators are, as well as other disclosures that have been other parts of the regulation are now put into this part of the regulation so that all disclosures are together. And then this doesn't mean that you can forget about your NC-SARA disclosure requirements, which often go to professional licensure, so don't forget those as well. So really, one of the big things about this regulation is that you really, as institutions, need to have a system of compliance in place to make sure that you are able to handle all of these disclosures, which again, are not just for online programs anymore, but are also for on-ground programs. So we really recommend a 5-step process that you start off by doing your due diligence, you identify what is required for the programs you have, you figure out where your students are located so that you can make sure that you have the proper disclosures related to their state, make sure that you have all of your public-facing documents with your disclosures to your website and your catalog. To the extent that you have programs where you need to do individual notifications to students, make sure that you do that. And that you've got systems in place to do that, and that you obtain acknowledgments as needed. So for example, if you have a program and you know that your program does not meet the state licensure professional requirements in a state where one of your students is located, we recommend that you get an actual written acknowledgement from that student that they understand that they're taking a program that's not going to allow for them to have licensure in the state where they're located. And then the last step is really, as you make new determinations, let's say you have a student in a state where you previously hadn't assessed whether or not your program meets state licensure requirements, if you make that new determination that, yes, we know that we will be able to meet the program requirements or we won't, that you're able to update that information and then reach out to students as required under the rules. So there's really a lot around disclosures.
And Lisa, just to be clear, on your step 4 of obtaining acknowledgments, one of the questions was you want to obtain an acknowledgement before they enter that program or pay any money, correct? Because I mean, you need to make sure that it's acknowledged at the time that they're going into the program.
Exactly. And the only change would be if for some reason there was a change to what you had said before. So now all of a sudden you are able to, or at one time you thought that you were approved, but now you realize that it won't lead to licensure because your state's changed its rules. So one of the things about the new regs is that they allow for early implementation. So an institution may choose to adopt these regulations early. And if you did so, you really need to have in place a good process around these disclosure requirements. Haley, do you think we have time for a poll?
I don't think so, since we have so many questions coming in. And one just came in about the obtaining the acknowledgement. And that, I'll let you answer this, Lisa. Is that acknowledgement required under the regs, or is it a best practice of step 4?
You know, it's interesting. The prior regs under the Obama administration required actually acknowledgements. And so they do not necessarily require acknowledgements in these regs, but it really is a best practice, and in some instances could be required just because you want to make sure that your students know if it's going to lead to licensure.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. So we're going to go ahead and skip our last poll question because we don't have very much time, and then talk about, Lisa, this last slide that we have is considerations. And so, you know, let's walk through kind of what are the considerations. Obviously, you've got some policy work to do, definitely in, you know, with student location and also transfer of credit policies, because a lot of our institutions' transfer credit policies really make a distinction between regional and national accreditation within their policy language itself. So there's a lot of you know, considerations you want to do in terms of policies, and then you have a couple other points too for institutions to consider.
Yeah, I mean we're really close to the implementation time. So I mean it would have to be an interesting situation in which you think you should early implement. But if you decide to do so, the department hasn't said exactly what you need to do to early implement. But if it's similar to the gainful employment early implementation option, then you could just do an internal memo saying that you're ready to early implement, and then you just begin to early implement the disclosure policy and other items related to state authorization. But really, it's a case-by-case basis. But with only about a little over 4 months to go before these go into effect, the key thing is really to make sure that you've got a really strong system around disclosures.
All right. So we have about 30 questions and not quite enough time to answer them with our time being out. So I think, Lisa, we're going to have to just get back to people individually on questions. One thing that I wanted to add, though, when I talked about our distance education and new requirements for SARA, if you are a client of Husch Blackwell, we have put out some helpful information and sample language for you. It's either within your portal, within your group, so lots of groups have their own portals, or there's our client portal as well, and it does give you some samples of what you can do to meet those state authorization requirements. So we want to make sure that that is out there, and if for some reason you don't know how to get onto your portal and you're a client of Husch Blackwell, please feel free to provide us with an email, and we'll send that out to you right away. And we're sorry if we're limiting it only to clients. It's only because we have an attorney-client relationship, and we are giving legal advice on how to meet these obligations, and so that's why. Or we have an association with your state in which you have access to some of our materials and things like that. So the example would be WACU in Wisconsin all can have access to that and is on their portal. So I just wanted to make that offer as well to anybody else who's asking additional questions. And with that, I just want to thank you for joining our program today. We hope that the information was helpful. If you have not done so already, please click the survey icon at the bottom of your screen and complete a small survey. Your feedback really assists us with future quality programs. Our next program in March is going to talk about Title IX, and as I've been saying since last September that the regulations are close to being dropped in our Title IX regulations. So at some point I'll be right, but I've been wrong for several months up until this point. So, but it will focus on Title IX and really talking about best practices as we are waiting for the regulations to drop in terms of buy-in and policy considerations, and that will be offered in March. So with that, I also wanted just to remind you that this program has been approved for continuing legal education credit in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and in Wisconsin and Texas it's currently pending. Usually we get that within a day or so of the webinar being completed. A recording of this webinar will be available to you tomorrow if you'd like to go through it again, or if you'd like to share it with others at your institution, you're welcome to do that. That link will be sent to you along with a certificate of attendance for attending the webinar today. This concludes our webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa, for all the great information, and thank you all for attending.